Yeah, 6:30.
Well, I would like to welcome you tonight to the opening of the 29th. I'd like to welcome you tonight to the 29th annual Sunday night lecture series of the Stonington Free Library. And I don't think we have ever had a lecture quite like this. Normally we hold it in the library on Broadway Square, which holds about 80 people. Tonight we are turning them away at the door very unhappily because we cannot have any more than 212 people here because of the fire code. Obviously, our very distinguished guests have drawn in here to discuss a topic that is, I think, of interest and importance to everyone. The media has certainly grown in its power and its reach and its influence on all of us. And in this last year, with an election, which seemed like a very long election, they may have played, well, we will see what gentlemen say, what sort of role they see that they played. We hope you will enjoy yourselves. I have a couple of things. The Como, I would like to thank the Como because they opened up this auditorium to us when we anticipated this large crowd. They have asked me to do two things. One is, I would like to point out the fire exits. There is one on this side, and then there are two exits in the back. And as you go through those back doors, then there are exits straight ahead or to your left and to your right. We're not anticipating it. The other thing they invite me to say is that if you have your cell phones, we would like you to turn them off. And then with that, I think we will see. I'd like to say a little bit about, your handout has a little bit about Mr. Saber and Mr. O.Elliot. They are probably, I think I would call them, two media giants in the country. Oz was for many years with Newsweek as editor-in-chief. He is the CEO, he is the chairman, and Oz belongs to us in Stonington. He's our own. Mr. Safer is probably, I'm sorry. Mr. Safer is probably America's own, because we have all known him for so many years as a correspondent and an editor of 60 Minutes. He has been in that position since 1970 and is almost probably like a member of many of our families. So, with all that, I welcome you and I hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much.
I'm supposed to be using the other microphone, I think. This is a good one? I need a good one, believe me. This guy needs no microphone at all. Now, the management has asked me to make a couple of announcements before we get started. Number one, those who are holding tickets here to the Dan Rather Memorial Service are in the wrong place. And secondly, for those recovering Democrats in the audience, this is the locus for the group therapy session, which will take place with Andy Maynard immediately after. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Molly, I can't see them, but I assume there are 4 or 5 of my friends there. I don't know who you are. And it's a particular pleasure to be here with my old pal, Paulie. And I thought we might just get one thing out of the way fast, Paulie, and that is Dan Rather. How the hell did he goof that badly?
This was one of those goofs that started at the lowest level and just, it's like one of those power outages where each step along the way failed miserably. I'll try and compact this story as much as I can. It's also an example of, you're familiar with it as certainly as an editor, when a reporter gets his or her teeth into a story, at some point along the way, it's very easy to lose perspective, to be of she was writing on. And the story that she had been working on for some time, apparently, was the Bush National Guard story. I don't think there's a soul in this country that doubts that George Bush was trying to avoid going into the military from Vietnam. I don't think there's, so right away you have to question, was it worth the trouble? She got sold a bill of goods with some documents that you know. Now, where the next failure up the line was her editors did not insist on knowing the source of the document. She said she'd given you. Louder, please. She claimed that she said she promised confidentiality to the source. Promising confidentiality to the source means you won't publish his name or his face. It doesn't mean you won't tell your editors. In this case, the editors did not insist or did not insist strongly enough. Rather, obviously, did not insist strongly enough. And this piece got in the air. The real tragedy of it was they had a perfectly good story without the phony documents. Perfectly good story that said, plainly as plainly could be, George Bush avoided going into the military, avoided going to Vietnam. Now, along with probably every other member of his class at Yale that year, by the way. Except for John Kerry. Except for John Kerry. And I think that we are paying a very, very heavy price. We 60 Minutes, are paying the price, even though it did not happen on our watch. This was something that they then called 60 Minutes 2, which was on a Wednesday program.
I'm sure you made yourself very popular around the office by being quoted in the New York Times and saying this would never have happened on 60 Minutes 1.
I was very popular in 60 Minutes 1.
Well, now, you know, I think that one should remember that this is not the first time that a hoax has worked against a journalist. And we've come a long way since the days of my old boss at Time, when I was a young writer on Time. There was a senior editor there who used to pronounce it, because he didn't know better, he called it a hoax. He would say, we always have to guard against a hoax, you know. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I think even he knows how to pronounce it now. We've got to remember that there were other hoaxes along the line, such as Janet Cook, which everybody remembers, and most notoriously, well, two most notorious ones. One was Clifford Irving, who phonied up Howard Hughes' autobiography, as told to him supposedly by Howard Hughes. McGraw-Hill paid $750,000 for the privilege of publishing that Howard Hughes biography, which of course was later exposed as being a total hoax. And then, of course, there was the famous Hitler Diaries. Now, most recently, in Dan Rather's unhappiness, the people who have been dancing on his grave with greatest élan are the editors of the New York Post, headed by Rupert Murdoch, the very fellow who bought the Hitler Diaries. I printed them in the London Sunday Times, I guess it was. When it was pointed out to him that they were a hoax, he said, well, you know, you can't win them all. So anyway, when are we going to have a resolution to this Dan Rather thing?
Well, the Thornburg Commission, could be called a commission, Lou Bacardi and the Thornburg, Bacardi's former head of AP, Thornburg was in the Reagan cabinet, and they are going to give their determination of the hoax. At some point, they did say early on it would not be before the election, which I think made perfect sense. We expected it by now, it's supposed to come out probably by, I would think, before Christmas. I know that, I suppose I can tell you that they spent all last week re-interviewing everyone. And the suggestion, they've also been brilliant and masterful at keeping their deliberations secret. The only bits of chat that we can get out of it is that it's going to be fairly harsh. So it's that much.
Well, there's one other hoax that I recall, which Newsweek almost fell for. It came within a tiny bit of a fraction of an inch of running a cover story on D.B. Cooper. I don't know if you all remember D.B. Cooper, the fellow who absconded with $200,000, hijacked, I think it was a Northwest Airlines airplane, and in mid-flight jumped out of the airplane with the $200,000 and disappeared forever. A very respected Newsweek correspondent out in Los Angeles was approached by somebody claiming to be D.B. Cooper. He had a whole story, laid it out, how he had planned this thing, how he had executed it. One of the key moves he made was to plant transponders in a field over which the plane was going to fly. He had a listening device of some sort that would be triggered by the transponders in the field, and he knew at that point that was the moment at which he should jump into a black night sky with his $200,000 in his parachute. Well, within a half an hour of being impressed with this long, elaborate story, one of our correspondents in the Washington Bureau, who is technically expert in all things, read the version of the story. He said, wait a minute now, a transponder planted in a field could not work at that altitude. It couldn't reach up 10,000 feet, wherever it was. And it was on that basis the story was killed. And it turned out to be a hoax. So let's go to the election. There's been a lot of criticism of the press for its election coverage or non-coverage. And the criticism, it seems to me, has come from right and left alike. It used to be that the press was attacked by the right guys, the right-wing guys, but now it's as much by the left-wing guys as by the right. How do you feel that?
We used to say that if both sides attack you, you must be doing something right.
Yeah, we know
But I don't
that's
think we
not
can say that anymore. What went wrong? Well, I think for a start, it was an election when one other important event was happening, and that is the war. And I don't care what anyone tells you, or anyone tells me, this election was all about the war. Not the economy, although that was important. Not health care, although that was important. Certainly not quote-unquote moral values, because that is not an issue. It was about the war, and I think that you cannot divorce the election coverage from the war coverage, particularly the run-up to the war coverage. You had this rather odd business of the New York Times, as you will all recall, a few months ago, doing this mea culpa about its irresponsibility covering the run-up to the war. So, having said that, I think the weakest part of the coverage, across the board, the newspapers, responsible television include the three traditional networks as responsible television and CNN. I do not include Fox in that. We're on a kind of the worst thing that can happen in journalism is PAC journalism. Here you have a perfect example of PAC journalism. Early on, just after the Democratic primaries, and even during the Democratic primaries, it was written that John Kerry is boring. I don't know what that means. Now, this came out of the mouth.
This audience may at the end of the evening.
This was the election when the newspapers and television were saying, we're going to talk about the issues, we're not going to talk about the beauty contest. You remember that. They all said it. From day one, it was a beauty contest, as far as the New York Times, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, name it. Now, I don't know that John Kerry is the most compelling man in the world. I think he's much more compelling than his opponent was.
But we decided that he was boring, he was lugubrious, there were all kinds of personality, superficial issues wrong with him. And everyone jumped on it. No one took a step back and said, hold on a minute, what do we mean by this?
Well, I think you want to also note the fact that Kerry was very slow to respond himself to the initial swift boat attacks, for instance. Now, we have to be out of the country, but I gather it took at least 2 weeks before anybody, beginning with Kerry, responded. And I've heard you say that you think
There
that
was a huge technical error.
he should have responded with anger and fury and rage and said, how dare these people attack my record in Vietnam? Nothing came forth from him.
And yet, you know, it's interesting, just the other night, I was with some people who were really very important workers of the Kerry campaign, not just here in the Northeast, but across the country. And they are living in kind of cloud cuckoo land to this moment, because what lost the election, they say, was the Republicans were able to pin gay marriage onto our candidate. And had it not been that, had not been this quote-unquote these moral issues, we would have won. They just don't get it, still don't get it. I think they had a perfectly okay candidate. I think they certainly had a highly intelligent man who was either had been driven into a state of kind of stasis from too many years in the Senate, partly, with arguments and deals, you know, constant compromising. You also had a guy who, because he came out of nowhere, wasn't sure what he stood for. I mean, he didn't stick with the message. He didn't go after, as I said, he did not respond to these distortions, the attacks, quickly enough. He didn't quite know what to do, and you know, what they do in television news broadcasts don't work. At least don't work because not enough people are watching. They change the set. In political campaigns, you fire the second guy down from the campaign manager. There's this turnover of guys who move from candidate to candidate. And at no point, I think, did John Kerry kind of seal himself in a room and say, what do I believe in?
Well, I think the Democrats now realize that they've got to have a message of some sort to put out there the next time around, and they've got to have a candidate who can put that message across.
I don't think they're not that smart. I'm sorry. What they're now saying is, how do we get the Jesus freaks? I'm serious. They just don't get it. I mean, one of the real difficulties that the party, the obvious difficulty that the party finds itself in is due to one man, and that is Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton took it just completely, and I don't mean in an unkind way, completely sold out what the party stood for in order to get elected. And he did. He did it brilliantly. He simply co-opted the entire Republican agenda, said it's ours, and he won 2 elections, leaving a party in total, absolute disarray that stands for nothing. Absolutely nothing. As we speak. You're right. That's what they've got to do. They've got to decide that liberalism, for example, represents the highest moral values, liberalism at its best. The government has responsibility for the least among us, that health care, that looking after people's health and looking after the poor is a quote-unquote Christian thing to do.
Well, they've allowed the Republicans to steal all that language and distort it in ways that can be very hard to untangle. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago the fact that so-called moral values, in your view, did not play that big a part, and I agree with that. In fact, it turns out that a number of people who marked moral values in their exit poll were people who voted for Kerry on the basis of the immorality of the war.
You know, the question itself was really flawed.
Yeah, they threw moral values in with Iraq, the economy, healthcare, etc.
And I dare say that just as many people on the issue of gay marriage, for example, which was just, you know, this was a minor thing. We look so silly in front of the world when they're making such an issue of it. But as many people who were against gay marriage voted for Kerry because they put your pluses and minuses in the guy and you vote for him.
Well, there's a particular hobby horse that I've been riding the last few days. That is, I think television has done a great disservice to this country by fixating on this visual image of blue states and red states. And it's a total misrepresentation of the complexities of this country that make up this country and this electorate. I mean, there are only 10 states in this country that were won by one candidate or the other by as much as 60% of the vote. 38 or 40% of the Texans voted for Kerry. And yet, seeing the blue state, red state thing on the TV screen, hearing the commentators talk about it endlessly, I think freezes a full set of divisions into place in this country. We all know that in a, quote, blue state like Pennsylvania, there are a hell of a lot of red voters. And we know, contrary-wise, that in a so-called red state like Ohio, that there were all but 2% were Democratic voters. By the way, I don't know if any of you saw the fact that Kerry ended up his campaign with $14 million unspent. That, to me, strikes me as absolutely inexcusable. And it seems to me that he could have bought another 65,000 votes.
I just really pick up on that. I don't think you can maybe narrow it down to blue counties and red counties. I mean, that's maybe if you're looking for a kind of ballpark. What's interesting, this whole red state, blue state started out invented by a friend of ours, by the way, the blue and the red, as purely and simply a way of showing on television map. This is back in 80s.
That's long before my time.
Electoral college votes. So when they Democrats blue, or they Republicans red. Actually started out the other way around. Started with the Republicans with blue, and Democrats with red.
We all know the Democrats are communists, right? Well, look, let's get back on the track. One of the great criticisms that have been made in this election year has been that in its obsession with, quote, balance, or nonpartisanship, or whatever you want to call it, the press has become, in the words of one person, there's a tyranny of even-handedness. And another one said that the press has been gelded by this desire to be so even-handed. With the result that they will say of one person, well, he may be a murderer, but the other fellow was actually convicted of jaywalking. I think there was a balance. How does one reach the right balance?
I think that yes, we were gelded, as you so politely put it. And I think that the gelding of the press was also the gelding of a good part of Congress. Happened post September 11th. There's no question. Everyone moved much more carefully, much more judiciously, often afraid to speak their mind for appearing to somehow
Be a girly man. Or unpatriotic.
Unpatriotic, really. And so there's that. And I think we are still suffering that, by the way. I really do. And the three anchormen were doing nothing but waving, have been doing nothing but waving flags since September. I'm sorry.
You know, this conversation reminds me of a great quote from the Daily Show not so long ago, Jon Stewart. And he asked the correspondent in the field, well, what do you think? What's your opinion? And the correspondent said, I don't have an opinion, John. My job is to spend half the time repeating what one side says and half the time the other. Little thing called objectivity, John. I think that sort of sums it up. But what is the answer to reporting something that is as complicated as a presidential election with some degree of balance and fairness, if not objectivity? I'm against objectivity, by the way. That strikes me as making up a laundry list of things on one side or the other. I think fairness is something one can aspire to.
Well, you know, I'll tell you, maybe we needed something that could be perceived as unfairness, more unfairness in the coverage, or more acid in the coverage, put it that way. A more skepticism. I think we really went into lockstep with both campaigns, by the way. Harsher on Kerry, no question. Much harsher on Kerry. Certainly not because of some interference by the front office to be soft on Bush. Put that out of your mind. He was guilty of a lot of things, but not that. I think that the president is a charming fellow when he wants to be, and presidents do have a way of, with that White House press corps, presidents do have a way of sucking up to the reporters, not those so that you can see it on the screen, by the way, if it happens. I think, on balance, we do a pretty good balanced job with some glaring, horrible errors. If I can take it beyond the issue of the election, just journalism is going through an absolutely horrible time right now because of the nature of the proprietorship of all of the big, all of the networks.
The corporate ownership.
It's beyond corporate. It's multinational conglomerates like Rupert Murdoch, like Viacom, people I work for, like Disney, like General Electric, so that there is no personal engagement. What we need are more Bill Paleys and even more Hearsts, where individual men, villains at times they may have been.
Or Harry Luce.
Or Harry Luce.
Or Catherine
Graham. People who were some sort of extension of the newspaper or the network that you were watching and reading. That doesn't exist anymore.
It's never going to exist again.
And it's only going to get much worse. And for example, I say no interference from front office, as far as I know, at CBS or CNN or ABC in terms of coverage. However, Fox, Murdoch is in the business purely and simply of making a lot of money with absolutely zero journalistic standards. Zero. I mean, it would make Colonel McCormick and Hearst look like saints.
Their diaries, for example.
And he is constantly using his newsroom to club the people he doesn't like. Constantly using his publishing house to club the people he doesn't like, or to get in good with the people he does like, like the government of China, for example.
Well, let's cite that example because it goes direct to your point, having to do with the biography or autobiography of the former Governor General of Hong Kong.
The former governor of Hong Kong, who was I think he started as a liberal Democrat politician, very talented man. When he finished his tenure, Hong Kong would take that, China. He had signed a book deal with Harvard to write Harvard Collins, to write a memoir, and he produced his memoir, which was it was an interesting account of his time in Hong Kong, and his dealings with the rapidly changing Chinese government.
Harvard Collins being a Murdoch property.
One of his many, quote-unquote, information property. And the Chinese had heard about the book, and Murdoch was in the middle of negotiating some kind of cable deal with China, a satellite deal with China, and the book was killed. This is the first time it's happened in Murdoch, and by the way, it also happened, something like that happened with General Elect with RCA and NBC, also over a deal with China, where I think a film was killed because they were about to sign something with China. And there's going to be more and more of this. Also, you should know that news has become a very expensive commodity. It's a very lucrative one too, particularly television. But very expensive. And we are under constant pressure to hold the line on budgets and that kind of thing. But also, and particularly on the most expensive kind of news coverage, which is foreign coverage. And if you wonder when we went to Iraq that most of the country had to find Iraq on the map, don't blame the government, blame us.
It costs, by the way, about $1 million to sustain one correspondent for a network for a year.
No, that's for newspaper.
Well, that's for a newspaper, so it costs a hell of a lot more for TV.
So it's a very expensive business, and we are probably, because it is expensive, at least that's one reason why, we are probably the most ill-informed nation in the world about the rest of the world.
And also, we'll go on to the next topic, but I think it also ought to be noted that people like Morley and 60 Minutes are forever under pressure from the, quote, management, ownership, etc., to go after a younger audience, whatever that may mean. Let's talk about the war a little bit more. The run-up to the war, we all know that there were very major lapses on the part of the press. There was a willingness to buy what Mr. Chalabi was saying about how the Iranians or the Iraqis would welcome us with open arms and flowers and chocolates and so on and so forth. We heard and saw Colin Powell deliver this extraordinary presentation to the UN rang true to all of us and all those editors out there. We heard Connie Rice talking about we don't want to see that smoking gun turned into a mushroom cloud. Nobody picked them up on any of this stuff. Why not?
Again, I go back to the 9/11. Also, Colin Powell was a very, was a brilliant salesman. I mean, he didn't sell it to most of the children or the friends, but he was a very sympathetic character, a great salesman. The other thing that happened is, just because they said it, it wasn't necessarily true, talking about weapons of mass destruction. But we couldn't disprove it. There was no way of disproving it. Even the best testimony of people who were going over the inspectors doesn't disprove it. So there was this, everyone, and wisely so, was hesitant to say, oh, he doesn't have it. Who among us could have said that?
Which reminds me of yet another quote from John Kerry. We'll go back to that for a minute. He said, who among us doesn't love NASCAR? Well, there's a real popular sport. Who among us indeed, Molly? Now, you won your spurs way back in Vietnam, and one of the most famous stories that Molly covered, as you all remember, was where the captain was talking about the village that they had to burn in order to save it. Inger was saying to me yesterday, Fallujah looks a little bit like that.
Yes, nobody's bothered to say it now. And I think that this war is going to be even more of a lingering disease than Vietnam became. I just do not see any resolution. I think the election will prove nothing. I mean, even an honest election will prove nothing. A lot of people will die probably in the course of the election and the election aftermath. A lot of Iraqis. The very idea of bringing democratic representative government as a piece of whole cloth to a country that does not have a clue what that means is absurd. Now, supposing there is an election, supposing it's a fair election, and the Iraqis say, yes, here we've done it, we've proven to the world we can do it, we're going to improve security, we're going to real representative government, we're going to be run by the mullahs that we want, the mullahs that hate you, infidel, that are trying to spread Zionism through the world. Perfectly good elected government, which is kind of what happened in Iran. They had, by the standards of the region, pretty fair elections. And the mullahs were all elected, and the council that really runs the country. And that's not good enough for this administration, or maybe any American administration. They don't want free and fair elections. They don't want democracy. I mean, our administration. They want countries that are friendly to us. And, had Saddam Hussein been friendly to us, nobody would give it a damn how many Iraqis he's loving.
What strikes me about some of the war coverage recently is, number one, I think it's gotten a lot tougher. And some of the very best war reporting I've ever seen has appeared of late in the New York Times, in particular by a guy called Dexter Filkins. I don't know who Mr. Filkins is, but I'm sure many of you have read his reportage in the last week and 10 days. Terrific battlefield stuff. Or in that instance, house-to-house kind of urban fighting. But I'm wondering what, as you won your spurs back in Vietnam, what is your view of the recent practice of embedding correspondence with the troops?
Well, first of all, Vietnam is a cakewalk to cover this thing.
Why?
There was no place in Vietnam that, certainly no city or even good-sized town, that I was ever afraid to walk in.
How about Hue in '68?
Hue in '68 was in the middle of a battle. That's a different matter, I'm sure. But routinely, I mean, we used to hang around Da Nang, which was right up in there, near the top, not that far from that. It was a hotbed of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese activity. They weren't singling out. They weren't even singling out GIs for the most part. They were fighting a very particular kind of war, where they were trying to suck the Americans into these set-piece battles, which they figured that they could either hit and run and cause damage and casualties and demoralization, or the kind of give them food that ultimately won them the war. Embedding a lot. I hesitate to be critical of my colleagues. I'm not really, but because there was no choice. Whoever came up with this system for the administration is absolutely brilliant. Probably Carl. By embedding a correspondent means you really control the course. You absolutely control his movement, and certainly in the earliest days of the war, the guys could not move beyond the vehicle that they were in. Barely get out of the vehicle. They had minders with them who were marking and recording or listening in on every conversation they had with every GI. You ensured that each reporter there had that kind of perspective on the war. It was simply what was happening in front of him. On the other, there is no alternative to that. There was very, very briefly at the beginning of the war where you could, and you or a couple of other guys could hire a man or a couple of jeeps and go looking for your own war. And that period lasted only really barely a few weeks, because now it has become impossible. And I know correspondents there who they live in either hotels or in that so-called green zone. And they've got an Iraqi reporter working for them, because he can go out and talk to people. They have a car. You can't drive your own car with a driver. You go out in the car. You lie down on the floor in the back, so that you're not seen by anyone in the street. You know, that's an awfully difficult way. The alternative to that is embedding with one of the unions. So in balance, obviously, embedding is better than anything else you could do now. And I agree with you. I thought that Filkins and all of these guys, and Don Burns and the others, are doing an absolutely brilliant job in the most difficult. I can't imagine just how awful it must be.
You know, I had a little conversation with the current editor of Newsweek just this past week, Mark Whitaker. I was asking how he was covering the war and so on. And he said, well, you know, it's a little hard to get people to go there these days. And that struck me as quite a different atmosphere from back in the 60s when everybody wanted to get to Vietnam. The press corps.
Yeah, and we had hundreds of airport in Saigon and just get on a helicopter that was going anywhere. There were helicopters going to virtually every part of Vietnam that you could possibly want to get to. And you could just on the ride. You could get on that one. There was another one coming up very shortly. And we literally hitchhiked around that country, courtesy of the U.S. military. And now we have huge public information officers in the Army and the Marine Corps. They use our Vietnam coverage of exactly how not to do it. I once spoke to this guy at War College, and they just, these were young lieutenants and captains, they couldn't believe that we could just jump in a helicopter. You know, they said, in Vietnam, my car, my press car, gave me the equivalent,
Assimilated rank.
assimilated rank of colonel.
Well, Morley,
I mean, I couldn't kick anybody off a plane, but I could kind of talk my way on.
I hate to tell you, Morley, but when I was out there once, Lieutenant General, we had that came up.
Yeah, he was kind of how crude can that be? He was what we would have called a rev.
Meaning?
A rear echelon motherfucker.
Well, just to come to back to a serious point for a minute, it's worth recalling that back in those days, there was a battle royal going on within the press about the coverage of the war. And there wasn't a week that went by that we rear echelon, you know what, in New York, weren't trying to adjudicate or triangulate the story as it was being reported to us by our correspondents in the field in Vietnam, and those in Washington who were giving the line from the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House. And there was one week when our Washington bureau chief came up to New York and quit in a rage because we had struck the balance too much in the favor of what we were getting out of the field. So those were very hairy days journalistically, too.
You know, there's another aspect to the war coverage and the run-up to the war and the continuing war coverage. A story that I don't think has been very well covered, and that is how this country is being viewed from overseas right now. I've been in Europe a lot in the last 6-8 months. I was in Romania during the convention, and it's really an interesting phenomenon for someone who lives in this country to watch those events live from overseas. You want to cringe in most of the speeches. The kind of awful bravado and
Bring them on.
Watching, actually I was there in the Democratic convention, and watching Kerry, watching any president or any candidate from abroad saying in that kind of superior American way, God bless America. People cringe when they hear that. That means, God bless us, screw you. That is the message that comes across. And I don't think, you know, this kind of global village that we now live in, the people in politics are the ones who least understand it. I was telling Roz, when we were talking about doing this, I said, you know, if Kerry or Bush, for that matter, at any point in their speeches at the convention, had said, I just want to take 2 minutes to address our friends around the world. that they're being broadcast live to friends and enemy alike. I can't tell you what that would have done for both men, for either man, and the country's reputation. Something, some little gesture. Instead, you have this kind of crusader talk coming out of America. And all of the God talk is what drives people to really advance overseas, particularly the French.
God, did you say?
God talk. You know, the French were the first, in the French Revolution, to really divorce the church and the state, and they did it by cutting off the heads of a lot of priests. But the country looks arrogant, foolish, and scary from overseas.
On that note, I have a feeling we probably ought to start winding down and go to the audience. Your mention of God reminded me of another something that Mark Whitaker of Newsweek said the other evening. He was on a panel of Newsweek of magazine editors, and they were discussing what sells magazines. And he said, I can tell you one word that sells Newsweek on the newsstands, and that's God. A bit surprising. One of the editors on this panel was the editor of Cosmopolitan. He said, that's terrific, Mark. She's given me a cover line for our next edition. God, you were wonderful last night.
We don't have a mic, so people might come forward and
You
need to speak very loudly.
There's one back there.
Yeah, do you think the equal time will ever come back?
The what time?
Equal time for broadcasting will
You're
ever
talking
come
about
back?
the FCC. Well, will it ever come back? No, absolutely not. Administration after administration, last 3 or 4, has so deregulated the broadcasting industry that in the deregulating, they take away all those areas in which broadcasters had to demonstrate their responsibility to public issues. And while we're on that subject of democracy, we are probably the only genuinely democratic country of the many and growing numbers in the world that does not give free time for party political broadcast. And the people who are the most strongly resistant, of course, are my bosses and all the network bosses. Because it's going to, elections are huge windfalls to the television networks, and particularly television stations. And I think we talk about the corrupting influence of money, and we're encouraging it. We're encouraging the corruption. And I think it's tragic. I would love to see a stronger FCC, one that just didn't look to be like bad press, F word, but really put the screws on the network. I mean, you used to come up with licenses every year. Every year, you had to demonstrate your amount of public affairs that you belong, all of that stuff.
Don't forget there can be some negative effects of that too. Back in Watergate days, Richard Nixon was threatening to remove the licenses, the broadcast licenses of the Washington Post Company if they kept exposing Watergate. So there's a reverse to that too.
Yes, well, I think what you want to do is have an FCC that encourages the substance of broadcasting and does not encourage the abuse in terms of withdrawing all public affairs shows us there's no requirement to put a single news broadcast on the air, right?
That's incredible. And I'm reminded, you said the occasional F word. There were 66 broadcast stations that were scared to show Saving Private Ryan on Veterans Day for fear that the FCC might find them. And I think Frank Rich said, is it any wonder that the networks are a little hesitant to carry a 60-year-old war, that they're a little hesitant to show such things as civilian casualties in a war that's going on today? Let's have some more questions. Yes.
Where do you see the United States 10 years from now, life in the United States?
Oh, that's easy. The question is, where do we see life in the United States 10 years from now? That's your field, Morley.
I'll tell you what I think that the United States is 10 years, maybe not 10, maybe certainly 20, will be a second level power like Europe. China is moving at such an extraordinary rate, and becoming more and more democratic, by the way, as it goes, and India. And it's a kind of unstoppable machine, China. And I think that, great empires come and great empires go. I think this empire is probably in its decline. And I don't think you can blame anyone. This is how time works.
I think the moment of decline was marked when a top White House aide was quoted in the New York Times Magazine a couple of months ago, saying scornfully to some reporter, well, you inhabit that reality-based world. We're in a new world now. We're an empire. And when we act, we change reality. I think that was the start of the decline right there.
You're talking a lot about journalism and how we're affecting people. One thing you haven't mentioned, and I realize a lot of these people never made it up to national correspondence, but a lot of people noticed it, the rise, especially in television, of the winner of Survivor becoming a correspondent and covering things. Someone who has no news coverage, who might have been athletic trainer or something in New York City, but was very charismatic on the show. I saw that a lot in the last couple of years. What do you think of these characters becoming correspondents? How has that affected your work?
Very good question. Again, I will defer to Morley because it does happen more in broadcast than it does in print. But I think it goes to the heart of a lot that's problematic in journalism, particularly broadcast journalism.
Yeah, I think, broadcast journalism over the decades finds gimmicks irresistible. Whether it was the kind of the caricature of the anchorman on Mary Tyler Moore show.
Ted Baxter.
Hairspray, all of that stuff. The fact is that in the networks, we did a pretty steady job, and continue to do talking about the free broadcast and avoided pretty faces like mine. So that we have done a pretty good job. I'll tell you something that is creepy, and Oz and I were talking about it earlier, and that is, and I think you mentioned it, this so-called the demographic, the 18 to 40 something. I've forgotten exactly what this one is. He's an advertising person out there, I'm sure you can tell. And so there is just beginning, we're just getting the first little electric shocks saying, should we go after more stories that will appeal to that demographic? My answer has been, so far, or mostly successful, is, do you think that what you're saying is that old people are smart, young people are dumb, so we got to go do more dumb stuff? Right? I dumb old people, a lot of awfully smart young people, and you're all interested in interesting stories. And don't know that we're not selling fashionable beer or God knows what. And all we can do is do what we've been doing. We've been very, very successful at it. And the moment you try, believe me, I've watched it happen, to pander to an audience is the moment you decline. You're out of business. And it's happened with all of the other things. I'm very pleased to say that both ABC and NBC in their magazines, which used to be on 8 or so times a week, down to once and less often, because they tried to pander to an audience. And I think, the audience that we have managed to hold for the last 35 or 8 years, it's been so long, and I'm so old when we went on the air. But,
What's your name again?
has been remarkably loyal. I've had their children there, and so have their grandchildren. And to think that some wise ass in Hollywood, many of these positions is going to come in and tell us how to put on an interesting television magazine is kind of crazy.
And yet you have to face the reality of keeping your audience up. Now I'm thinking of Dan Rather stepping down from March, whatever it is, and who's going to replace him?
I have no idea.
You haven't got a bench, have you?
We don't have much of a bench, but we don't have what we used to have. We used to have an enormous bench of really talented correspondents.
Why is it not a woman who would be stepping into Rather's place?
Why not?
Well, I'm told that women, according to the conventional wisdom, do not command the audience that men do.
That I don't know. See, I shy away from trying to analyze what an audience does. The moment you start wondering what an audience does, you can become tongue-tied because you don't know what you're supposed to say to them. You know, audience A likes stories about chorus girls, and audience B likes stories about foreign policy, and audience C, you can't aim the news. And I don't think, by the way, if you put an intelligent, interesting person who can write reasonably well up front of you or evening news, man, woman, white, black, it's going to work. And it has worked. It's worked for years of work like that. I think that Diane Sawyer is perfectly capable of doing what you do, but she probably doesn't want to. Don't blame her. Because it's becoming increasingly irrelevant anyway, as we all know. It makes a lot of money, it still makes a lot of money with networks, but you all know, this crowd certainly all know what's happening in the world long before 6:30 that evening. You've listened to the radio, you've been watching CNN, all of it.
And been online.
And been online where you have great disinformation, misinformation.
That's Andy, isn't it over there?
Yes.
This is our local mayor, otherwise known as our
Good
ward.
to see you again. No, it's on the same topic a bit, but I'm terribly concerned about the influence of outlets like Fox News and the enormous worldwide reach. I can't go into a health club, a car service place, any other establishment where Fox News isn't the preferred channel, broadcasting almost like wallpaper to the world. And they do it with a flash and a style and a live feed across the bottom, and it always seems like it's clicking along. And yet, as you indicated, there are no journalistic standards. I don't know if you have any information on their relative market share, but they certainly seem to be gobbling it up.
I can't give you precise numbers, but what's interesting is that the traditional networks Fox's share of the national audience is tiny compared to the least successful network broadcast. I mean, they boast about their reach and all that. The fact is, it's tiny. CNN is even smaller, by the way.
Much smaller. Fox is running away with it, you see it.
They're running away with it, but it's still a very, very small audience. I think that people, to some extent, do watch news. Whether you try to put on news as news or you try to put on news as entertainment, an awful lot of people watch news as entertainment. And I think that a good part of that Fox audience watches it as entertainment. What else would anyone want to watch? What sane-sentient person would want to watch Bill O'Reilly's who's he going to kick in the whatever it's called?
Well, I feel better. Thank you.
What do you see the future for 60 Minutes?
It's interesting. You know, our audience has declined just as the overall audience of television has declined, and television is becoming more and more kind of boutique as opposed to supermarket. So that, I mean, since when I joined CBS 40-odd years ago, 3 networks own 100% of the viewers. That audience has been reduced by almost 60%. It still makes like great money, by the way, for the broadcasters. But the cable and between cable and the internet and satellite television and all that, the audience has eaten away. The profits are still very, very high. So I think 60 Minutes is going to be around. I think it's in very good and safe hands now. But the executive producer is a young man named Jeff Fader. Young man is just going to be 50 next week. A child.
All the way in the back there, yeah. In the middle.
For what positive aspect? Hello, Oz. For what positive aspect of how President Bush governs this country do you have the greatest respect and admiration? And I'd like you to answer the same question about President Clinton.
Francis, I want to make sure you got the question.
Yeah, so do I. What positive act, what positive part, what would I regard as his best, most interesting, whatever, positive aspect of his governance?
Yes.
Is that it?
Yes.
Well, some people's positive is somebody else's negative. The most remarkable thing about the Bush administration is how it keeps its secrets. And that truly is remarkable. In my memory, I can't think of an administration that's kept the lid on as effectively as this one. It's also, I should think, that in purely kind of housekeeping terms and bureaucracy, it may be the best run administration in the history of the country. So, is that possible?
Yes.
And what was the proposal?
I'd like you to answer the same question about President Clinton.
The most positive aspect of the Clinton administration, I think, was, and I go back to something I was talking about earlier, was the perception of this country overseas. I think that there was great respect and great affection and kind of sense of, well, they really had an interesting guy running that. And of course, all the moral outrage here was considered laughable No, I think that's the real difference. The real difference. And George Bush had that respect and sympathy of the country did immediately after 9/11, as you remember. And I think he handled himself brilliantly in that period, by the way. And that certainly is a positive aspect, part of his governance. I think that between George Bush and particularly Rudy Giuliani, who became a national figure in a day, the country, the uncertainty that was going on, we all remember how uncertain things were in those days, would have been much greater. I think they both did very well.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your view on the role of the media in reporting and underreporting, really, the facts in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Because when you read foreign English or other newspapers, you get a much fuller picture. And I don't know about TV, I don't have much chance to see foreign TV, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on policy and your ideas about this underreporting of the facts in Palestine and Israel.
Well, first of all, I would disagree with you. I think, I read a lot of foreign coverage, in particular British coverage, and you know, papers like The Observer and The Guardian, who are becoming kind of Murdochian on the left. That's such a word. And really have become propaganda organizations for the PLO. People don't consider PLO as being a terrorist organization anymore because they other more terrifying terrorist organizations. It still is. So I think there is a different kind of perception. Also, much of both the Intifada and the money that's spent on, and most of that money is stolen, of course, provided to the Arafat organization, came from European governments, and from the European Union as a collective. So they have a bigger stake in it in a certain way. Now, I think that the reporting here has been much more even-handed for reporting in this country.
I think that maybe the questioner was suggesting that there's not so much a lack of even-handedness as there was a lack of reporting, period. And I think, quite frankly, that's a reflection of this current administration as having bowed out of that whole play until very recently.
Well, you know, the Times continues to do a pretty, I think, a first-class job covering the Middle East. I mean, certainly over the last, really, since long before this most recently.
I think we better start winding this down. I hate to leave this audience without some solutions of some sort. We'll take another couple of questions, and then maybe Molly and I can talk for 2 minutes about what might be solutions. Yes, sir.
Hi. First of all, I just spent 8 years as a journalist in the Army, and I'd be willing to consider taking Dan's job in March. The question regards war coverage in Iraq. What do you think about, I've heard of course I wasn't there, but I've heard back in World War II, the journalists would kind of do a little bit of self-censoring, or the armed forces would censor them a bit before they reported their stories back. What do you think about,
It was full censorship.
What do you think about, you know, the question of doing that now, in light of things like the footage we saw of the Marine shooting the man at the bomb? Should we do more of that, or less of that self-censorship?
No, well, I don't think we should. I think The answer is no. There should not be censorship. The only kind of self-censorship that I or any of my friends in covering not just Vietnam, but a couple of wars in the Middle East and Africa as well, is the kind of self-censorship that could genuinely, that without which you genuinely put many people's lives in danger. That's a form of self-censorship on a particular story. The Army, the military thought about censorship in Vietnam, and then they realized how possible it would be. They just weren't set up for it. You would have needed censors who spoke and read half a dozen languages to set up any kind of censorship in Vietnam. The reporters there from all over the world. It just doesn't work. I mean, I've worked on stories in places where there is censorship, like Egypt and Syria and Jordan and briefly Iraq, long time ago. And when you had to submit your copy and everything else, you could always, there's just too many ways of getting around it. And now it's satellites and the internet. How do you impose censorship then?
And the cell phone.
And the cell phone.
Let's take one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would like you to comment on this propensity to challenging sources. That now there's throwing press people in jail or challenging the keeping sources private.
Well, I'll give a stab at that. I think it's a very dangerous precedent to be in the process of being set. The question has to do with reporters who are being threatened with jail sentences and indeed in some cases being sent to jail for not revealing their confidential sources when pressed to the wall by some district attorney or another. I think that's a very, very dangerous precedent and threatens the First Amendment rights in a very serious way. And I hope that a solution to that increasing trend can be found in generating more shield laws in states that do not now shield journalists from that kind of an attack by local DAs.
Yeah, I think this is one area where we do have one area in contemporary journalism where we do have the public on our side. I think for the most part that we should be able to maintain confidential sources. And, but I'm so curious about it is obviously you're referring to the CIA story. How nobody's covered this guy.
I think Novak is totally culpable. I think it'd be nailed to the wall for what he did.
I understand that, but he didn't do it alone. He got a phone call from somebody, for sure, and we can only guess who it came from. One suspects.
Your friend Rove again, right?
Certainly, I should think somewhere in Pennsylvania.
Let's try to wind this up with a couple of thoughts about what solutions might be found to this increasing dilemma of the press and its trustworthiness and the effectiveness or non-effectiveness with which it carries out its job. I don't really have any big solutions. I would suggest, though, that we might go in the direction, once again, towards something like what existed for 10 or 15 years, called the National News Council. Now, the National News Council was never very effective, mostly because the New York Times never got behind it. To do something like that in the world of the press, you've really got to get the big boys, and particularly that big boy, on board to be effective. I think that that could be a step in the direction of restoring trustworthiness in the press. I think it's up to the journalism schools certainly to continue to instill in their young students a sense of mission. Ollie and I were talking the other day, when we were young reporters and young editors and young correspondents, we had the feeling that what we were doing counted. And I don't get that feeling from some of the young journalists that I know. They tend to view their jobs as a job. So those are a couple of thoughts that I have.
I agree. Long after I started out, I love doing what I do. I love doing what I do because, first of all, it's you fly first class and somebody else pays for it. You go to places you would otherwise not get to. You can indulge yourself in terms of the kinds of stories you want to do, and it counts. At least I still believe it does, and it's important and it's fun. And what better life is there than that? Having said that, I think one of the reasons it seems to count best to young reporters and editors is that we're awash in so-called news. So, think about the amount of stuff that comes at us every day. I'm very early riser. I get up at 5:30, 6 in the morning before the paper comes. I've read the New York Times by 8 o'clock without even picking up a newspaper.
Well, to your point, I think that's a very interesting point, this avalanche of information. I mean, when you did that story about we had to burn the village to save it, that got through. When we were doing stuff on civil rights at Newsweek, that got through. When Ed Murrow was doing Harvest of Shame, that got through.
These were very distinct broadcasts, and they had a powerful effect on people. And I think that people are kind of telling out now, and you got to keep raising the stakes. You've got to. They have to do snuff news now. Who's going to die tonight? Right, stay tuned.
Well, now, the final thought is there's a quotation that has appeared on the masthead of an Aspen, Colorado paper over many years, which is something that all journalists can aspire to do. And that is, as independent as finances allow.
I think so. I hope so.